There is a story about Easter Island that most people know. A small civilization, isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 3,000 kilometers from the nearest inhabited land, cut down every tree on their island. They used the trees to build the great stone statues, the moai, hauling them across a progressively barer landscape until there was no forest left. Without trees, they could not build fishing canoes. Without canoes, they could not reach the sea. Without the sea, they could not feed themselves. Without food, they turned on each other. They toppled the statues. They went to war. The population, which had once numbered in the tens of thousands, collapsed to a few hundred before the first Europeans even arrived. They destroyed their paradise, and then they destroyed themselves. This story is told in environmental textbooks, in popular science documentaries, in museums, and in one of the most widely read works of popular history of the last 30 years. It is used as a parable, a warning about what happens when a society refuses to stop consuming its own resource base. Easter Island becomes a mirror for the modern world, a small, isolated, finite system running out of everything that made it livable. The story is wrong, not in every detail. The deforestation was real. The trees did disappear. The moai did fall, but the population did not collapse before the Europeans arrived. The island was not a wasteland of warfare and starvation when the Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen stepped ashore in 1722. What Roggeveen found was a functioning society, smaller than its peak, certainly, and adapted to a drastically transformed landscape, but alive, organized, and working. The catastrophic population collapse came after European contact. It came from disease, from slave raids, and from the full weight of what European colonialism did to small, isolated, and defenseless populations across the Pacific and around the world. The real story of Easter Island is not a story about self-destruction. It is a story about the resilience and ingenuity of a people who adapted to one of the most extreme environmental transformations any human community has ever survived, and who were then nearly destroyed by forces that came from the outside. It is a more disturbing story than the ecocide parable, because it does not let the islanders bear the blame. The blame falls on contact, on disease, on kidnapping, and on colonialism. On us, not them. To understand what actually happened on Easter Island, you have to start not with the collapse but with the beginning. With the people who first found the island, what kind of society they built, and why they built it the way they did. Rapa Nui, the name the island's people gave it, meaning something like Great Rapa or simply the navel, sits at the southeastern corner of the Polynesian Triangle, roughly 700 kilometers west of Chile and 200 kilometers east of Tahiti. It is volcanic in origin, roughly triangular, about 24 kilometers at its widest, formed by 3 extinct volcanoes whose slopes roll down to cliffs and coastal rocks. In its pre-human state, it was forested, densely, with a species of large palm that palynologists call Pachylococos disperta, the Easter Island palm, now extinct, a relative of the Chilean wine palm that could reach heights of 15 to 20 meters. That palm produced large seeds, provided timber, supported a canopy under which ferns and other subtropical vegetation flourished. Seabirds nested in millions across the island, enriching the soil with guano. The people who settled it arrived from somewhere in eastern Polynesia, the Marquesas, the Gambier Islands, or possibly the Society Islands, most likely between 800 and 1000 AD, though some researchers argue for settlement as late as 1200 AD, and the debate is genuinely unresolved. What is clear is that they arrived with the standard Polynesian colonization kit: outrigger canoes, breadfruit seedlings, taro, sweet potato, sugar cane, chicken, and the Polynesian rat, Rattus exulens, which the Polynesians brought as a food source and which came along on every canoe whether invited or not. They would have found an island that, by Pacific standards, was not especially productive. The soil was thin. The climate was subtropical and unpredictable. There were no sheltered harbors. The coral reef was thin, and the marine resources, while substantial, were limited compared to the more productive lagoon systems of Western Polynesia. But there was forest, and there was land, and there were no other people. For a small founding group of perhaps a few dozen or a few hundred individuals, it was enough. What they built over the next several centuries is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of Oceania. The moai, the great stone figures that now define Easter Island in the popular imagination, were carved from compressed volcanic ash at a quarry in the crater of the volcano Rano Raraku. There are 887 moai recorded by archaeologists. The largest that was ever moved from the quarry and erected on its ahu is Paro, on the Ahu Te Pito Cura platform, standing roughly 10 meters tall and weighing 82 tons. The largest moai in the quarry, never completed or moved, is El Gigant, 21 meters long, perhaps 270 tons, carved partially free from the rock face and apparently abandoned mid-work. The moai were not idols in the Western religious sense. They were not objects of worship. They were representations of deified ancestors, chiefs and high-status individuals whose mana, their spiritual power, was believed to flow from the moai into the land below, protecting the living community that erected and cared for it. The moai face inland, toward the people they protect, not toward the sea. Each ahu, the raised stone platform on which moai were erected, was a community shrine and burial site combined. The construction and maintenance of these monuments was the central project of Rapa Nui's social and religious life, demonstrating the ancestors' power, demonstrating the community's ability to serve that power, and in the competitive logic of Polynesian chieftainship, demonstrating that your ancestors were more powerful than your neighbor's ancestors. The ahu were not simple stone platforms. They were complex structures, some with corbelled chambers inside, some with carefully fitted stone facades that show masonry skill comparable to anything produced in the pre-Columbian Americas. The moai themselves were carved by specialists using basalt hand chisels, the tools worn and replaced thousands of times in the service of a single figure. Carving a large moai from the soft volcanic tuff of Rano Raraku probably took a team of specialized craftsmen 1 to 2 years. Erecting it on a coastal ahu, fitting it to the platform, and placing the red scoria topknot, the pukao, a separate carved cylinder weighing several tons, required engineering precision and organized labor on a scale that implies a sophisticated, not a primitive, social organization. The moai also had eyes. White coral eyes with dark obsidian irises were set into the sockets when a moai was formally dedicated on its platform. The eyes gave the ancestor the power to see, to exercise his protective mana over the land. When a moai was ceremonially deactivated or desecrated by a rival clan, the eyes were removed or destroyed. An activated moai was a living spiritual presence. A toppled, eyeless moai was a defeat. The spiritual stakes of monument construction were not decorative. They were the organizing logic of the entire civilization. This competitive logic drove an escalation in monument scale over several centuries. What began as relatively modest stone figures grew, generation by generation, into the massive constructions that have astonished visitors since Europeans first laid eyes on them. And this matters, because the popular narrative assumes that building these statues required cutting down the forest to provide timber rollers and ropes. If the statues required the forest, then the deforestation was a direct consequence of the monument building, and the collapse of the forest was inseparable from the competitive social logic that drove construction. That is the core of the ecocide argument. But the moai, almost certainly, did not require log rollers. In 2012, archaeologist Carl Lipo and anthropologist Terry Hunt, working with a team of islanders and a replica moai, demonstrated that a moderately sized stone figure could be walked upright using 3 ropes and a small team. 1 rope attached to the head to prevent tipping, 2 ropes attached to the body on alternating sides, pulling forward in a waddling motion. The evidence in the archaeological record supports this. Some unfinished moai found in transit positions show the base worn from walking contact. The roads from Rano Raraku Quarry to the coastal ahu show patterns consistent with upright movement. Forest was still useful on Rapa Nui, for houses, for canoes, for fuel, for palm nuts. But the deforestation was not primarily driven by the need to transport giant stone statues on log rollers. That specific link in the causal chain appears to be wrong. The deforestation was real. The palm forest and the woodland it supported were gone by somewhere between 1400 and 1600 AD, depending on location and the type of pollen evidence used. But the causes were more complex than they cut down all the trees to move their statues. Agricultural expansion was one cause. The settlers cleared land for cultivation, just as Polynesian farmers did everywhere in the Pacific. Fire played a role. But there was another cause that the popular narrative tends to understate, and it is a small brown animal that weighs about 60 grams. The Polynesian rat arrived on Easter Island's canoes as it had arrived everywhere the Polynesians settled. On most Pacific islands, the rat's impact was balanced by the presence of natural predators, by the regenerative capacity of more complex and diverse forest systems, and by the sheer abundance of resources. On Easter Island, the conditions were different. The Easter Island palm produced large, nutritious seeds, exactly the kind of food that rat populations could exploit at scale. And crucially, when the rats ate the seeds, the forest could not regenerate. Unlike many trees, the Easter Island palm depended entirely on seed germination. Vegetative regeneration was minimal. As the rat population grew, and on an island with no natural predators and abundant food, it would have grown exponentially. It consumed the seeds that would have become the next generation of forest. Trees were still dying from human cutting, storm damage, and age. New trees were not growing back because every seed was being eaten. The result was a deforestation that was not simply the product of human overconsumption. It was the product of a rat-driven collapse in forest regeneration, combined with human agricultural clearing, playing out over several centuries, a pace that was too slow to be visible as a crisis within any individual human lifespan. No single generation of Rapa Nui people experienced the forest as abundant and then watched it disappear. Each generation inherited a landscape slightly more open than the previous one. Each generation adapted to that landscape and called it normal. This is not a story about a people who saw the problem coming and refused to stop. It is a story about a slow ecological shift driven by forces that were not fully visible to the people living through it. And through it all, the people adapted. This is the detail the ecocide narrative consistently omits. As the forest declined, Rapa Nui farmers developed one of the most innovative agricultural systems in Pacific history, lithic mulch gardening. They covered their fields with layers of broken volcanic rock, basalt, obsidian, ash, deliberately and carefully. The rocks retained moisture in the dry season, prevented erosion of the thin topsoil by wind and rain, regulated soil temperature so that temperature swings between night and day were moderated, and slowly weathered to release trace minerals into the soil. It was a labor-intensive system. It required breaking, transporting, and placing enormous quantities of rock by hand. But it worked, and it worked in conditions where ordinary agriculture would have failed. Modern analysis of the extent of lithic mulch garden coverage across Easter Island has led archaeologist Cedric Puleston and his colleagues to argue that the Rapa Nui agricultural system, at its maximum extent, could have supported a stable population of somewhere between 3,000 and 17,000 people. A wide range, but one whose midpoint is well below the catastrophic collapse figures in the popular narrative, and one that suggests a managed adaptation rather than a runaway crisis. The moai toppling that the popular narrative presents as evidence of social breakdown is also more complex than it appears. The ahu platforms across Easter Island show that moai were deliberately pulled down, their faces toward the earth, a powerful act of desecration in a culture where the ancestors' gaze carried spiritual meaning. But the toppling was not the result of collective despair or ecological desperation. It was warfare, inter-clan competition by other means. In Polynesian culture more broadly, destroying an enemy's sacred monuments was a form of conquest, breaking the mana of the rival's ancestors, demonstrating the superior power of your own. The timing of most moai toppling is debated, but much of it appears to have occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries, not in a single cataclysm but in a series of ongoing interclan conflicts. It was real conflict, with real human cost. It was not the death throes of a civilization in ecological freefall. When Jacob Roggeveen arrived on April 5, 1722, Easter Sunday, which is how the island got its European name, he was commanding 3 ships of the Dutch West India Company, looking for the hypothetical southern continent that European cartographers insisted must exist to balance the landmasses of the northern hemisphere. He found Rapa Nui instead. His account of the landing describes, in detail, a functioning society. He saw people working in gardens. He saw chickens. He saw the moai still standing on their platforms, which he initially mistook for clay figures before realizing they were stone. He estimated the population at between 2,000 and 3,000 people. He described men of large stature and good physical condition, wearing ornaments and headdresses, clearly organized under a social hierarchy. The first contact was not peaceful. When the landing party went ashore, a fracas broke out. Accounts differ on who initiated it, and Roggeveen's men fired into the crowd, killing at minimum 12 people and probably more. The islanders, who had no firearms and no prior knowledge of what they could do, were astonished and terrified. Roggeveen's ship stayed for a week, trading with the islanders and conducting observations, then left. They took nothing and they left nothing. What they may have left, invisibly, was disease, the pathogens of the European world for which the Rapa Nui, like every other isolated Pacific population, had no evolved immunity. The next major contact was the Spanish expedition of 1770 under Captain Felipe González de Hito. He arrived with 2 frigates, conducted a formal ceremony, claiming the island for Spain, and had 2 Rapa Nui leaders sign a document they could not read, and that transferred their sovereignty to a monarch they had never heard of. The Spanish noted extensive settlements, gardens, and a population they estimated at around 900 to 2,000. They departed without incident. Again, the invisible vector of disease may have traveled with them. 4 years later, James Cook arrived. Cook was an experienced Pacific navigator, careful and systematic, and his 1774 account of Easter Island has been deeply influential. He found the island largely treeless, which it was, and the moai in various stages of toppling. Most significantly, he estimated the population at only 700 to 900 people. This is the data point that anchors the ecocide narrative. By 1774, the population had collapsed to less than 1,000. Therefore, the collapse happened before European contact, or very shortly after Roggeveen's brief visit. Therefore, it must have been ecological, not colonial. But the timeline does not work as cleanly as this argument suggests. Between 1722 and 1774, the island had been visited by at least 3 European expeditions. Each brought pathogens. The Rapa Nui had no immunity to smallpox, measles, or influenza diseases that had swept through Pacific island populations with devastating speed throughout the 18th century. A population of 2,000 or 3,000 with 0 prior exposure to European disease could have been reduced to 700 or 900 in 50 years of low-level epidemic contact. This would not have required a single dramatic epidemic. It could have come from persistent, low-level transmission across 3 or 4 epidemic events, compounding each other as the population's immunity remained essentially 0 throughout. Lapérouse, who visited in 1786, estimated the population at 2,000, higher than Cook's estimate 12 years earlier, which either reflects recovery, different methodology, or different sections of the island surveyed. The population figures from these early visits simply cannot bear the weight of the argument being built on them. The definitive evidence that the population collapse was not primarily self-inflicted comes not from the ambiguous early contact period, but from the events of 1862 and 1863. In November and December of 1862, Peruvian slave ships arrived at Easter Island, multiple vessels, in at least 8 separate raids across the southern summer. They deceived the islanders into coming aboard with goods and trade offers, then took them by force. When islanders on shore resisted or tried to rescue those already captured, the slavers fired on them. Over several months, approximately 1,000 to 1,500 people, current estimates range, but the consensus is around 1,000, were taken from an island whose population at the time was probably no more than 3,000 to 4,000. They were shipped to the Chincha Islands off Peru, where they were put to work excavating and loading the seabird guano that was then the most valuable agricultural fertilizer in the world. The conditions on the Chincha Islands were brutal: open-pit labor in choking dust, minimal food, crowded barracks, inadequate medical care. Smallpox was endemic. Within months, the majority of the captives were dead. The diplomatic outrage was swift, driven largely by the Bishop of Tahiti, Tepano Jawson, and by the French government, which had commercial and missionary interests across the Pacific. Peru faced international pressure, agreed to repatriate surviving workers, and paid a nominal compensation. Of the roughly 1,000 to 1,500 Rapa Nui people taken, approximately 15 survived long enough to return home. Those 15 people carried smallpox back to Easter Island in 1863. The epidemic that followed was catastrophic. By 1877, when Chile conducted the first systematic census of Easter Island, by then in the process of annexing it, the island's population was 111 people. Not thousands, not hundreds, 111. This is the collapse. This is where the handful of survivors of the popular narrative actually comes from. But it does not come from deforestation. It does not come from ecological self-destruction. It comes from a specific sequence of colonial violence. Slave raiders who took 1/3 of the population in one season, a disease that killed most of those taken, and a disease that the survivors brought back to finish the work on those who had stayed. The Rapa Nui people were nearly erased not because they had destroyed their own environment, but because they were small, isolated, defenseless, and valuable as forced labor. The 15 people who returned to Easter Island in 1863 came back to a world that had been half-emptied while they were gone. The slave raids had taken not just population but structure. The island's social hierarchy, its chiefs, its ritual specialists, its navigators, its doctors, its genealogists, had been systematically removed. In the logic of the Peruvian slavers, the people with the most authority on the island were the most valuable. They could command others to come aboard, so they were taken first. What remained on the island after the raids was a community that had lost most of its leadership and much of its institutional memory in a single season. And then the smallpox came. Among those taken in the slave raids were the island's paramount chief, Nga'ara, and virtually the entire class of people who could read and write Rongorongo, the remarkable undeciphered script that exists on carved wooden tablets found on Rapa Nui and nowhere else in Polynesia, and which may represent one of the very few cases of independent writing system invention in human history. These individuals died on the Chincha Islands. The knowledge died with them. When the missionaries and scholars who arrived in the 1860s and 1870 asked the surviving elders to read the tablets, no one could. The script has never been deciphered. It almost certainly never will be. The Rongorongo tablets themselves. There are only 26 known surviving examples, scattered across museums in Chile, Russia, the United States, and Europe, remain one of the genuine mysteries of human history. The tablets are flat pieces of wood, some barely larger than a paperback book, others the size of a surfboard, covered on both sides with tiny incised figures. Birds, fish, plants, geometric shapes, human figures in various postures. The figures run in alternating lines, right to left on one line and left to right on the next, so that the reader would turn the tablet at the end of each line to continue reading. This Boustrafetin format is unusual but not unique. The symbols are consistent enough across multiple tablets to confirm it is a script, not just decorative carving, but no decipherment has succeeded. Every attempt has foundered on the same problem. There is no bilingual key, no known language to which Rongorongo can be anchored, and no living reader. The knowledge died with the people who were taken. The story does not end at 111 people, though. The Rapa Nui people did not vanish. They survived. They rebuilt. When Chile formally annexed the island in 1888, not asking the Rapa Nui people what they wanted, but arriving with a warship and a flag, there were still Rapa Nui people on the island. Chile's approach to the island they called Isla de Pascua was to lease it to a private sheep ranching company, the Compañía Explotadora de Isla de Pascua, which fenced the entire island, ran sheep across the land that the Rapa Nui people had tended and adapted for centuries, restricted the remaining population to a settlement at Hangaroa, and treated the island as a commercial property. The Rapa Nui people did not receive Chilean citizenship until 1966, nearly 80 years after annexation. For most of that period, they lived effectively as prisoners on their own island. In 1914, a Rapa Nui woman named Angada, elderly, charismatic, claiming prophetic visions, led a rebellion against the sheep company's control. Her followers slaughtered the company's cattle, asserted their claim to the land, and held out against the company's security forces for weeks before Chilean naval authority reimposed order. Angada died shortly afterward. The rebellion failed in its immediate aims, but the fact that it happened at all, that a people reduced to 111 survivors in 1877 had within 40 years rebuilt enough community cohesion and cultural memory to organize a collective resistance, tells you something essential about what the Rapa Nui people were. They were not passive victims of their own short-sightedness. They were not, as the ecocide narrative implicitly presents them, a people so foolish and so blind that they destroyed the very foundation of their civilization, and then suffered the consequences in bewildered misery. They were adaptive, ingenious people who responded to one of the most extreme environmental transformations ever visited on a human community by inventing new agricultural techniques, maintaining a complex and sophisticated religious and social life, and continuing to build and care for the monumental tradition that expressed their identity for centuries. When the external destruction came, and it came with ships, guns, diseases, and chains, they survived that too, and went on to resist colonial control as soon as they had the numbers and the will to do it. To understand why the ecocide narrative was so convincing for so long, it helps to understand how it was constructed, and what evidence it had to set aside or overlook to hold together as a story. The foundational evidence for the pre-contact collapse argument was pollen data. Botanist John Flenley and archaeologist Paul Bond, working in the 1980s and 1990, extracted sediment cores from the island's volcanic crater lakes and analyzed the pollen record within them. What they found was unambiguous on the main point. The forest that had dominated the island for centuries was functionally gone by approximately 1600 to 1650 AD, replaced by grass and sedge pollen consistent with an open, degraded landscape. This was a genuine scientific finding. The deforestation was real, and the pollen data documented it precisely. The interpretive leap came next. Flenley and Bond, and later Diamond, assumed that this deforestation caused agricultural collapse, which caused population collapse, which caused the interclan warfare that toppled the moai. The assumption was logical. It was not crazy, but it was built on a model, the linear crisis chain, that the archaeological evidence has since complicated substantially. What the pollen data did not show was the population trajectory. Pollen cores tell you what grew. They do not tell you how many people were alive when the forest disappeared. For that, you need other evidence: archaeological site surveys, radiocarbon-dated refuse middens, artifact distributions, house foundation density. And when archaeologists, especially Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo from the early 2000s onward, conducted systematic surveys of the island's inland sites, what they found was not the signature of a crashed, diminished population, but of a population continuing to use the land intensively, farming, building, maintaining the rock mulch systems. even after the forest was gone. The population estimates in the popular narrative are worth examining on their own terms. Diamond cites a figure of 15,000 at peak, sometimes up to 30,000, followed by collapse to a few thousand before European contact. Hunt and Lipo, after their fieldwork, argue for a much lower maximum, around 3,000 to 5,000 people, that remained more or less stable. A separate team, led by Cedric Puleston, used spatial modeling of the lithic mulch garden system's productive capacity and arrived at a median estimate of about 6,000, with a plausible range of 3,000 to 17,000. None of these figures are precisely established. The island has never produced the kind of dense, stratified, long-occupied residential deposits that allow confident population reconstruction. But if the baseline population was never 15,000 to 30,000, then there was no catastrophic collapse to 30,000 to 1,000. The collapse partly evaporates when the initial estimate is revised downward. What does not evaporate, even on the most conservative population estimates, is the horror of 1,877. 111 people. That number is documented. Whatever the peak was, 3,000 or 15,000, the drop to 111 is catastrophic. The question is when it happened and why. And on that question, the evidence is not ambiguous. The documented, verified, witnessed catastrophe is 1,862 and its aftermath. The slave raids, the epidemic, the deaths, the 15 survivors returning with smallpox, not the cutting of trees in 1,400. The role of the Polynesian rat in the deforestation of Easter Island is not just a piece of ecological trivia. It matters for the moral architecture of the story. If the rats, not just the islanders, drove the forest's inability to regenerate, then the deforestation cannot be read as simple human failure. The Polynesians brought rats to every island they settled. On other islands, the forests survived because the ecosystems were more complex. The islands were larger, the regenerative capacity was greater. Rapa Nui was at the extreme edge of the Polynesian colonization range, the most isolated, the smallest and most fragile. The rat on Rapa Nui was not a consequence of human greed or short-sightedness. It was a consequence of the foundational act of Polynesian civilization building, getting in a canoe and sailing to the most distant habitable point on Earth. There is one piece of evidence that illuminates the navigational and cultural ambition of the Rapa Nui people in a way that almost nothing else does. A 2020 genetic study published in Nature found traces of Native American ancestry in the Rapa Nui population dating to approximately 1,150–1,230 AD. Centuries before any European reached South America, let alone the Pacific. The most likely explanation is that Polynesian voyagers, sailing east from Rapa Nui, reached the coast of South America, made contact with native South American populations, and returned with genetic admixture and almost certainly with new plants. The sweet potato, which is native to the Americas, was already present on Rapa Nui and across Polynesia at European contact. The Rapa Nui people were not a civilization stranded at the end of their range, turning inward in isolation. They were a civilization actively probing the limits of the navigable world. Jared Diamond, in his account in Collapse, makes the Easter Island story a warning about the failure of societies to manage shared resources, the classic tragedy of the commons applied to a forest. He asks, rhetorically, what the Easter Islander was thinking when he or she cut down the last palm tree. The question is vivid and effective as a rhetorical device, but it is almost certainly not how the deforestation worked. There was no last palm tree cut with full knowledge of what it meant. There was a slow degradation over centuries, with rats eliminating regeneration before any human consciously decided the forest was gone, with each generation adapting to a landscape they had inherited already slightly more depleted than the one before it. This matters not just for the people of Rapa Nui, but for the lesson the story is supposed to teach. If Diamond's version is right, if the Easter Islanders destroyed themselves through obvious, visible, and stoppable resource consumption, then the lesson is about governance and political will. Societies can see their collapse coming and choose to stop. If the actual history is right, if the deforestation was driven partly by rats, unfolded gradually across centuries, and if the population collapse came from epidemic disease and slave raids, then the lesson is different and harder. It is about the vulnerability of small, isolated systems to forces they did not create and cannot individually prevent. It is about what contact between unequal civilizations actually does to the smaller one. It is about the ways in which the most dramatic collapses in human history are often the product not of internal failure, but of external destruction. The moai still stand on their ahu platforms along the coast of Easter Island, those that have been restored anyway. The most famous restoration is Ahu Tongariki, where 15 moai were pulled upright by Japanese engineers in 1992-1996 after a tsunami had toppled them in 1960. They stand in a row, facing inland over the land they were carved to protect. The landscape behind them treeless and wind-scoured, and studded with the rock mulch gardens of their makers. In the crater of Rano Raraku, hundreds more moai are buried to their necks in the sediment that has accumulated over centuries, each with a face still sharp enough to show the individual features the carvers gave them, each with a full body buried underground, each half-finished or finished and waiting. The quarry abandoned mid-work sometime in the 17th or early 18th century, the stone cutters called away and never returned. Standing in that quarry is an unusual experience. You are surrounded by evidence of extraordinary human ambition and capability. The scale of what the Rapa Nui people accomplished, the logistics of quarrying, transporting, erecting, and maintaining hundreds of multi-ton stone monuments, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, on an island 24 kilometers wide in the middle of the most remote ocean on Earth, is genuinely astonishing. The argument about whether log rollers or rope walking moved the statues is a technical question. The organizational capacity required to mobilize the labor, feed the workers, maintain the tools, and coordinate the clans over centuries is not technical. It is a statement about what kind of civilization this was. There is a specific quality to the resilience shown by the Rapa Nui people that gets erased when you substitute the ecocide narrative for the actual history. The ecocide story requires the islanders to be foolish, unable to see that they were destroying their own foundations, locked into a competitive frenzy that overrode common sense. The actual story requires them to be something far more impressive. A community that faced genuine ecological degradation, acknowledged the new conditions of their world, and rebuilt their subsistence system around those conditions using the materials they had, which was mostly rock. The rock mulch gardens are the evidence. They are labor-intensive, carefully planned, precisely laid out across the volcanic landscape of the island. They represent not the last desperate act of a dying civilization, but the pragmatic ingenuity of a people determined to survive whatever their island could or could not give them. It was a civilization that adapted. It was a civilization that built. It was a civilization that survived a millennium in one of the most demanding environments on Earth and responded to ecological stress with innovation rather than collapse. And then it was nearly destroyed in a decade, not by its own failures, but by the arrival of slave ships from a continent that most of its people had probably never imagined existed. The story of Easter Island is not a mirror for modern environmental problems, or rather, it can be a mirror, but it reflects the right thing only if you tell it correctly. The correct reflection is not, look what happens when people overuse their resources. The correct reflection is, look what happens when a small, isolated, and vulnerable society encounters a more powerful one that values its people only as labor. Look what happens when disease travels faster than diplomacy. Look what happens when the historical record gets read backwards, when the collapse that outsiders caused gets blamed on the people who were destroyed by it. Today, there are approximately 8,000 people of Rapa Nui descent, many of them living on the island. They have spent decades asserting their rights to the land that was taken from them during the Sheep Company era. In 2010, the Chilean government began formal negotiations over land restitution. In 2017, Rapa Nui communities established their own governing council in direct challenge to Chilean administrative authority. The political struggle is ongoing and unresolved. The people are there. The moai were not a death wish. They were an affirmation. They were a civilization statement carved in volcanic stone, that the ancestors watch over the living, that the community is protected, that the mana flows from the past into the future. The stone figures standing on their coastal platforms, facing inland toward the people, are still making that statement. The people are still there to receive it. That, more than any parable about cutting down trees, is what Rapa Nui actually teaches us. That survival, adaptation, and resilience are as much a part of this story as loss. And that when we misread the history, we misread who is responsible for the destruction. The last tree did not seal the fate of Easter Island. The first slave ship did.